So now we're ready to start the presentation. The following program contains subject matter that may be inappropriate for younger viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. This case is incredible. It has infidelity, covert spying, implied mental illness, lies, deceit, and so much more. If this was a TV show, you'd say, come on, they made this up. This is goofy. But it all happened in Scottsdale in the 1970s. There is one crime scene photo in this presentation, but I've removed the body. You'll just see the outline of the presentation. If you have questions, I'd like to ask that you ask them at the very end. And that's why we give you the blank paper. If you need to write down notes or write down a question to ask me later on, you're all set. Those of you who've been here before know about my planned tangents. I get so excited talking about Scottsdale history that I go off on tangents, and I know this about myself, so I put it in. My all-time favorite tangent I ever went on was about Theodore Roosevelt at the Roosevelt Dam and how that powered the growth of Scottsdale and the whole valley. This is my close second favorite tangent. This was so good that I had to make a tangent about a tangent about a tangent because I couldn't not tell you the whole story. It's just too much fun. Okay, Scottsdale today. According to the 2020 census, there are 241,000 people living in Scottsdale on 184 square miles, 31 miles long and 11 miles wide at its widest part. Our current mayor is David Ortega, who was just elected in this last election, and he was just inaugurated, installed, whatever we do to mayors, in January 2021. Let's go back in time to the year 1976 so we can start to think about what it would be like to live in Scottsdale back then. You see, from this map, like Deer Valley shows to be about the halfway point. It's not, but it appears to be the halfway point in the city based on the way these lines are put on. Now let's go back in time. Now Deer Valley is the northern tip of Scottsdale. So Shea is kind of the center line of the city, the dividing line between north and south. So if you moved here in the 70s, that's what you think of when you think of Scottsdale. Our mayor was William Jenkins. He was appointed mayor after Bud Timms resigned, and he filled out Bud Timms' term from 1974 to 1976, then he was elected until 1980. A lot of people wanted Herb Drinkwater to be mayor, but Herb said, I will not run for mayor as long as William Jenkins is the mayor. I like him, I trust him, I respect him, and I'm not going to do that while he's the mayor. Well, he decided not to run for re-election in 1980, and Herb ran for mayor, and then he won again, and again, and again, and served for 16 years, and the only reason he finally didn't seek re-election was he got cancer and died about a year later. Had it not been for that, he still probably would be the mayor of Scottsdale. Just incredible. So in 1976, our population is 78,000 people, and it's on 88 square miles. Let's talk about some cultural touchstones of 1976 so we can put this kind of into perspective. The winner of the Best Picture in 1976, Rocky. It beat out All the President's Men, Bound for Glory, Network, and Taxi Driver. Interestingly, Rocky only won 3 Academy Awards compared to All the President's Men and Network that won 4. The number 1 TV show in 1976, Happy Days. It beat out Laverne and Shirley, ABC's Monday Night Movie, MASH, and Charlie's Angels. A new show that year in 1976 was the show Alice, which was supposedly set in Phoenix. And the number 1 song for the week of May 6th, 1976, the theme song to Welcome Back, Kotter. I did not remember that was such a popular song that it went to number 1, but it did the week of May 6th, 1976. Now let's take a look at policing back in the day versus policing today. So here's a picture of Don Reardon, badge number 134. And for those of you in person, he's actually seated right there in the third row. He just put his hand up. He is standing in front of a Bricklin SV1. In 1975, the city of Scottsdale owned 3 Bricklin SV1s for 1 year, and a 1-year lease for $1 a car. It's a long story, I won't go into it, but next session in the spring, I'm planning to repeat Scottsdale Behind the Stories, where I tell all about the story of the Bricklin car and how it got to the Scottsdale Police Department and where it is now. Now, Officer Reardon would have on a gun. Officer Reardon, or Don, what gun would you have had back then? 357? Smith & Wesson 16 rounds? Wow. Cool. So he would have had that. He would have had handcuffs, mace, flashlight, a radio, and don't forget the dreaded ticket book. Now compare that to the year 2019. In February, one day we had snow, and an officer was up on Carefree Highway, and someone snapped this photo of him. This is Officer Fernandez Cafati. He's badge number 1,476 compared to Officer Reardon's badge number 134. And he is standing off of Carefree Highway. It looks almost fake with the brown background, but I guess it was when the sun was going down and there was clouds in the sky. I don't know. But look at what he's got on. He has a ballistic vest. Officer Reardon was not wearing a ballistic vest. He has an on-body camera, a taser. He's got Narcan. That's the injection they give to people with opioid overdoses. He had a tourniquet in case he's the first responder to something where someone was losing blood from a limb, to close off that so that they can be saved by the time the fire department gets there. He has evidence bags. He has rubber gloves on. All the things that a police officer has today, but he also has the dreaded ticket book. So let's go and tell about the backstory. Jesse Austin is our victim of this story. He was born in Kentucky in 1941, and he was raised first in Indiana and eventually in Bisbee, Arizona, around the time of junior high. His father was a miner in Bisbee, and Jesse really didn't know what he was going to do in his life, but we'll talk about what he did in just a second. According to his family, he loved his family, riding horses, hunting, and all sports. At the time of 1976, he was 35 years old, 5'11", about 180 pounds. So just you to understand the geography, if you're new to Arizona, you are right there. Jesse lived way down there, right off the Mexican border in Bisbee. And Bisbee is a remarkable, remarkable town that has this incredible story, so I'm feeling it. It's time for a planned tangent. Let's pull back the curtain in Bisbee and let's find out a little bit about this town. There's a man named Jack Dunn in 1877. He was working for the U.S. Army in their conflict with the Apache Native Americans, and he was searching for water for his little squadron, and he recognized in an area that was at that time called Mule Mountain. He was in the lower part, which they called Mule's Gulch. He recognized the signs of iron ore. So he went back and he talked to his boss, Lieutenant Rucker, and they decided to form a partnership. And with a third man, they decided to start a mining operation there. But they needed someone who knew mining. So unfortunately for them, they chose George Warren. Now, George Warren, interesting miner, but he unfortunately liked to drink alcohol. And while he was drinking alcohol, he liked to gamble. And these are not good characteristics for someone you're about to trust money with. So the three of them, the three partners, gave George Warren their money and said, go over to Fort Huachuca, file a mining claim, and then hire some miners and buy the supplies so you can start the mine. So George went to Fort Huachuca, which today is just outside of Sierra Vista, which is about 18 miles away from Bisbee. And George, well, I'll tell you the rest of it in just a second, but before I do, I have to tell you, John Rucker was an actual hero. One of his officers was trying to wade through a river, and he got stuck, and he got pulled down, and he couldn't get out. So Lieutenant Rucker dived in after him, and unfortunately, they both drowned. So he is out of the picture, and that probably led to a lot of the problems that would happen later. So George has all this money. He goes to Fort Huachuca, and he finds there's a gambling, and he starts drinking alcohol, and before you know it, he spent all the money that he had. So in order to do what he's supposed to do, he has to convince a bunch of people to lend him money. And they'll only lend him the money if he tells them where he was going to go mining. So they go and they claim the area a mile north of that. And to their credit, they put him on the claim for a 1/9 share of anything they came out of that mine. The first mine drilled down, and unfortunately, it hit groundwater and filled up. It was completely useless. But if you ever go to Bisbee and go to stay at the Inn at Castle Rock Hotel, which, by the way, is supposed to be haunted, you can actually see from the front lobby, you can look down and see the original shaft. It's actually quite cool. The Copper Queen mine was the mine that was a mile north of that, and that was the motherlode of mines. They pulled out in 100 years $6 billion of ore from that mine over 100 years. And had George Warren kept his 1/9 share, that would have been worth $20 million in 1887. By our terms, it would have been $500 million. We would have Warren something everywhere in every city. Everyone would know George Warren. But instead, George Warren got drunk one day, and he bet another person that he could outrun a horse. Now, the way this worked when you're sober is apparently if you put two stakes 25 feet apart, or 25 yards apart, and you raced it, you could run to one stake, turn around and come back. Apparently, you could outrun a horse because the horse couldn't turn around fast enough, supposedly. But when you're drunk, you forgot about the two stakes, and he just challenged him to a race for 50 yards, lost the race, and lost his share of the Copper Queen mine, and therefore he never got a penny. He died penniless in Bisbee, Arizona. Now, so that was the tangent within a tangent to tell you about George Warren. Now here's the tangent within a tangent within a tangent. You see the picture of George Warren. This is a famous picture. And you probably have seen about this. This one, I love this, the tangent within a tangent within a tangent. So this is the photo of George Warren, and it was taken by C.S. Fly. He was a famous photographer in Tombstone. He owned property around Tombstone. In fact, he owned, behind his photography studio, he owned this empty lot that was right up against a little thing called the OK Corral. And what happened this particular day was, in 1880, was that there was a big fight, and before you know it, on C.S. Fly's property, the gunfight at the OK Corral happened, which is never at the OK Corral, but I guess it didn't sound as fun to say the gunfight at C.S. Fly's empty lot. I think OK Corral was a better name. And that's a picture showing that the photography studio was literally like part of the story. And even if you watch the movie Tombstone, you'll see that Ike Clanton goes into the photography studio, which may or may not be historically accurate. The other thing that C.S. Fly was famous for was General Crook came in to accept the surrender of Geronimo, and C.S. Fly went with him and took the famous picture of Geronimo, which in the bottom left-hand corner, it says copyright C.S. Fly, Tombstone, Arizona, and the year that he took it. So even the picture of George Warren has a tangent within this tangent. Now, the photo of George Warren ends up getting displayed in the Bank of Bisbee, and by a man whose last name is Brophy. And Brophy hangs this up, and his message to people was, be careful, if you're coming to Arizona to think you're going to make your fortune, because you could end up like George Warren and die penniless. Even though you struck the mother lode, you make a couple bad decisions. So he had this hanging up, and one of the people who worked for the bank ended up as part of the Constitutional Convention of Arizona, and he was put in charge of the committee that come up with the Great Seal of Arizona. So what are we going to put in on this Great Seal? Well, they decided the 5 C's of Arizona: copper, climate, citrus, cattle, and cotton. Thank you. So they're going to put it in. They're going to hire a artist who worked for the Arizona Republican newspaper to draw this Great Seal of Arizona. And this guy on the committee said, you know what you got to do? You got to see this picture of this guy in Bisbee. He's perfect for it. So if you look now in the Great Seal of Arizona, and let's zoom in for a second, there you see it. George Warren is in the Great Seal of Arizona. Also, let me just show you really quickly for those of you who remember the whole thing about Theodore Roosevelt. They also put the dam is to the right of George Warren in the picture, and then the water coming off the dam. So it's also in this. Again, this is not just my opinion. This is, if you get from the Secretary of State's office, if you get the book explaining the history of the Great Seal, and look on page 12, you'll see George Warren's picture. That this is all part of it. How cool that this town, which had so many ups and downs, ends up being represented on the Great Seal of Arizona. Now, Bisbee, Arizona today is a pretty funky town. 1975, the last mine shut down, and they converted that into a mine tour. So you can go through the Copper Queen mine tour. Very interesting if you've never done it. There'll be a picture of it later on in this presentation. But there's another thing that's really fun, and by the time you guys know that with the spooky stories thing, I kind of like that stuff, that whole paranormal thing. They had a ghost tour of Bisbee, and just before the pandemic, my son and I went on it. And he thought I was just showing him some funky part of Arizona. He didn't know I was doing research for this presentation. He figured it out pretty quickly, though, when he couldn't get me out of the historical museum there in Bisbee. But it's just a funky, neat town. There's a bunch of steps if you like climbing steps. And if you find it hard to go up and down steps, it is hard to do the ghost tour. There's a lot of walking up and down steps. But a really cool town today. At one point, Bisbee had 20,000 people living there. It was the biggest city in Arizona. And today there's less than 5,000. So enough of the tangent. Let's go back to the story. So if you remember, our victim, Jesse Austin, went to Bisbee High School, and he was a star athlete. He was on the track team. Here he is right there. He was on the football team. This is the year from his junior year. There's Jesse. And this other guy, Doug Nip, he was the quarterback. Jesse was the halfback. And the year when Jesse was in his junior year, the Bisbee Pumas had a record of 9 wins and 1 loss, and they made it all the way to the conference championships. So Jesse and Doug Nip were like local sports legends in Bisbee. Here's his senior portrait from high school and a family photo of Jesse. And notice something that I don't know if you can see it down, that his name is listed in the high school yearbook spelled incorrectly with an I in Jesse. There was no I in Jesse. He was all about family. In 1960, just a month or 2 after graduating high school, he married his high school sweetheart, Sandra Lynn Garcia, who became Sandra Lynn Austin. And she's going to play a very important role in this presentation. He got a job with his father in the Copper Queen mine and went to work there, as they called it. They worked underground for about 7 or 8 years. And then he decided he had had enough. And his timing was pretty good because it was right before the Copper Queen mine closed. He did a couple of different odd jobs, and eventually he was hired by UPS, and his wife got a job at Fort Huachuca in Sierra Vista. Fort Huachuca is the communications hub for the U.S. Army. So everyone learning how to do communications goes through Fort Huachuca. And in 1975, UPS went from a regional small delivery service to nationwide delivery. And so they opened up an office in Sierra Vista and they hired Jesse as one of the delivery people. By 1976, Jesse started having a strange problem at work. See, in UPS, they would give you a number of boxes that was your number of boxes for the day. And then you delivered them and you couldn't go home till all the boxes were delivered. So he would take the boxes off, he would deliver them. And then at the end, when he'd come back to his truck, thinking that this was the end of the day, he'd find 3 or 4 boxes there. Thought that was strange. I wonder why that would happen. So he would go and deliver them, but it would make him late. Instead of being done at, say, 5 o'clock, he might not be done till 7 or 7:30 or even 8 o'clock. It was almost as if someone was trying to get him to be late all the time. And he didn't know why. So he made a complaint to UPS. He said, something's going on. Are you guys deliberately putting boxes on after I leave? And they said, no. Then he made a complaint to the union. At one point, he started feeling like maybe he was going crazy. So his wife had him go to a psychiatrist, travel to Tucson to go to a psychiatrist who diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic. Then one day, as he's about to come back to get the last box, he sees a guy who looks like he's got a brush cut, about 6 feet tall, very thin, putting these boxes back on for him. And he thinks, that looks like someone from the base, from Fort Huachuca. What are they doing? And he says, hey, the guy runs off. Somehow he gets an idea that this is going on, but he doesn't know why. So he goes back to town and he's talking to one of his buddies, and one of his buddies essentially tells him, well, you know Sandy's having an affair on you, right? With someone from the base? And he says, no, I don't know anything about that. So he gets all upset. And he goes home that night, around April 25th, 1976, and he decides to have a little confrontation with Sandy. So he approaches Sandy and he says essentially, hey, what's going on? Why do I keep hearing about these boxes and they're putting on my truck and it makes me keep going late? And you're telling me I'm going crazy, but I saw somebody do it and now I hear you're having an affair? Well, Sandy would have none of this. She gets on the phone and she calls the police, and in this case, the Cochise County Sheriff's Office. And suddenly the story changes. Suddenly Sandra tells the deputies that Jesse thinks that the police, the military, the CIA, the KGB, everyone is conspiring against him, make it sound like he's delusional. And then she tells the officer that just last week that he had pulled a gun on her. And Jesse says, no, you pulled the gun on me. I took it away from you. It's over here. I have the gun because I took it away from you. Well, the police just arrest him. And Sandy asked for a competency hearing. So they go before the court a couple of days later, and it gave her enough time to go to Tucson, back to that psychiatrist's office, and get a letter saying that Jesse was not mentally competent, that he was a paranoid schizophrenic. And the judge orders him to Arizona State Hospital in Phoenix on 24th Street in Van Buren. Well, he's in there. He's doing really well. Everyone likes him. He gets along with everyone. And the staff thinks he's probably not needed to be at the state hospital. Jesse says, if I could just get a weekend off and go talk to Sandy, I could patch this up. Will you give me a weekend pass? And they say, yeah, we'll give you a weekend pass. In fact, this weekend coming up, the weekend of the 7th, 8th, 9th, you can have a weekend pass and try and patch this up. So Jesse gets on the phone and he calls Sandy and says, Sandy, I can come home. We can patch this up. And she says, no, don't get anywhere near me. You're crazy. I don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, you got a brother who lives in Scottsdale. Go visit him for your weekend pass. Then she hangs up the phone and she calls the hospital and says, how can you let this guy out? He's crazy. He's going to kill me. And if he comes out and kills me, I'm going to sue you. Something like that. So he calls his brother and says, would you pick me up? I've got a weekend pass. And his brother, Wally, He says, absolutely, I will come and pick you up, but I don't have my driver's license right now. My girlfriend, Lorraine, will give you a ride. So here's, again, if you remember Scottsdale, Wally lived right around here, which is just a little bit north of Indian School Road and about 81st Street. And Wally worked for Camelback Inn. He'd been there for over 10 years. After high school, he worked in the mines for a year or two, decided it wasn't for him, and he decided that he wanted to go in the resort industry, and he got a job from the original owner of Camelback Inn, and then when it became a Marriott property, he stayed there for a total of 13 years, but I'm jumping ahead of the story. So here is Scottsdale, an aerial photograph in 1976. You notice, there it is. You notice down here, there's no 101 freeway. There's no car dealerships down here. Right down here, it's just farmers' fields. Those are apartments now. There's a golf course right there. It's all just empty land in Scottsdale in 1976. So here is where Wally lives. And yes, in this thing, everyone has an E-sounding name. Jesse, Sandy, Wally, and you will meet Eddie in just a minute. So if I get them confused, holler out and straighten me out. Okay? So his home plays an important part, but also this area, which was Earl's Market and the Marcraft Pharmacy. And the Marcraft Pharmacy had a lunch counter, and that is in the story as well. But you see that this is a very short distance. You could easily walk from Wally's apartment or condo over to the Marcraft Pharmacy where they had the lunch counter. And here's a picture of where Wally lived with his, where Wally worked with his girlfriend. This is the Camelback Inn. So they make arrangements. Lorraine and Wally drive up to get Jesse from the state mental hospital, and they take him back. That's what it looks like today. On Friday, May 7th, 1976. Now, the next section is the breakdown of what we know from the murder, so we're going to do it with a little clock so you understand the time frames. On Saturday, May 8th, 1976, it was the next morning. Jesse's been out of the state mental hospital for a night, and Wally tells him, I've got to go to work. Here's $10. Go to Marcraft Pharmacy and get some breakfast there. They have good breakfasts. You'll like it. And of course, in 1976, $10, that would probably be 5 meals at a lunch counter. But he gives him $10. He says there's no food in the house, and head over to Marcraft Pharmacy. He then calls a cab company. This is Wally. Wally takes the cab to Camelback Inn, where he goes to work for the day. Now, he's really nervous about leaving Jesse. Jesse's told him a lot about what's going on, how upset he is, how he's trying to reconcile with Sandy, how Sandy won't take his calls. He's been calling Bisbee. He's been calling his friends and acquaintances and trying to track down where Sandy is, and he can't find her yet. So this is 8 in the morning. This is the last time Wally sees him. At noon, Wally calls Jesse and talks to him, just says, how's it going? How are you doing? And he says the same thing, I'm upset. I really wish I could get a hold of Sandy. I've been trying to call her all day. Wally says, look, I'm going to leave work early at 2. Lorraine will give me a ride home. Let's talk about it, and let's see if we can come up with a solution. Jesse says, okay. I'm okay with that. Now, at 12:25, Jesse calls the village cab company, the same cab company that Wally uses to take him to work every day. And at first, the dispatcher thinks that it's his brother, Jesse, but it's Wally. And he says, very interesting statement. We want to go get steak and a beer. Where's a good place to get steak and a beer? And the dispatcher says, well, you could go to the Lulabelle, you could go to Joe Hunt's, you could go to the Pink Pony. And Jesse says, Joe Hunt's, can you send me a cab? I'd like to go to Joe Hunt's for steak and a beer. Joe Hunt's today is probably around the area sort of where P.F. Chang's is at Fashion Square, across the street on the south side of Camelback. So the cab is dispatched at 12:25. And remember, he said, we want to get steak and a beer, not I. It's kind of weird. 12:35, the cab arrives, and this cab driver is very familiar with picking up his brother, Jesse. So he knows where to go, and he honks the horn. And nothing happens. Nobody comes out. So the cab driver gets out of the cab, and he gets close to the place, and a dog starts to bark. And it's behind a fence. He can't see the dog, but he hears rah, 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 rah. So he wants to have nothing to do with the dog. He goes back to the cab, and he calls the dispatcher on his radio and says, can you call this place, call the Austin apartment, and let them know I'm out front? So the dispatcher calls, and there's no answer. 12:35. 12:43, the cab driver gave up, and he leaves the area, and he gets a new dispatch. Now at 2 o'clock, Wally and Lorraine come home, and this is what they find. As you see, I've removed the body, but I've put in a chalk outline. And if you can't see it, this is his head, this is his right arm, his left arm is here, this is his left leg and his right leg. He's slumped over. You also notice that there's a table upside down, things are knocked down, it's disheveled. So at first, Wally and Lorraine come in and they think that Jesse must have committed suicide. But then they realize, no, it's too chaotic, it's too crazy. It doesn't look like anything that you think of a suicide. It looks like a struggle took place. So they call the police at about 12:04. And part of the problem why it took them time to call the police was the phone was ripped off the wall. So they had to go to a neighbor's to get a phone to call the police. And 3 detectives are assigned to the case. Ron Dean, badge number 126, Brick Goodman, number 144, and Dennis Borkenhagen, badge number 170. And as it so happens today, Dennis Borkenhagen is right in the room. If you put up your hand, Dennis. So you're here when 2 of my heroes of Scottsdale police history are right here in the room at the same time as you. And for those of you online, you're sort of here online. He's just a few feet away from the camera. So it's pretty close to having him right next to you. So unfortunately, Detective Borkenhagen was at another homicide all night from 74th Street and Coronado. So they allowed him to go home and get some sleep before he joined the investigation for this case. And they start going through all the things, interviewing all the people, interviewing the neighbors, examining the evidence. This is from the case file. This is a stab wound diagram that shows the 3 fatal stabbings were here in the chest area, but there were 25 stab wounds in total. And they started interviewing some of the witnesses, and one of the neighbors is really observant. He said, people keep commenting about this phone repairman who's going knocking on everybody's door looking for this house that ends up being Wally's apartment. But there was a problem that one guy's noticed, because we're thinking 1976. So if you're a phone repairman, there's only Mountain Bell. There's no other repair company. If you have a repairman for your phone, it's a Mountain Bell repairman. So they saw this repairman, and he had all the tools, and he looked like he could be a repairman, but his hat didn't have the Mountain Bell logo on it. His shirt didn't have a Mountain Bell logo on it. And nobody in the neighborhood, even those who were walking in the neighborhood, no one saw a truck with a Mountain Bell logo on it. It was this repairman just showed up to try and do a repair and then disappeared. His description was about a 25-year-old male, almost 6 feet tall, about 150 pounds, with short brushed hair, like as if he was in the military. Interesting. That's a clue. Then someone did a composite sketch, and this is what one of the composite sketches looked like. This also will become a clue. You will see this later on. Well, the Scottsdale police contact Sandy and say, Sandy, we really need you to come up here. Your husband's been murdered. He's been stabbed 25 times. It's probably smart if you have somebody drive you up here because you're probably going to be upset, but we really need you here in Scottsdale. So she drives up, and here's a picture of what Sandy looked like at the time. And she comes in with one of her friends from the fort named Edward Dwyer, known as Eddie, because like everybody in Bisbee, it has to end in an E. So there's Sandy and Eddie, and they drive in, and they get interviewed. And they get interviewed separately, but a strange thing happens. When they interview Sandy, she starts off the interview by saying, I just want to let you guys know, between the hours of 12 and 2, I was at this door and this door, and I got into a fight with the Sears clerk, and she'll remember me. The detectives look at each other and say, we didn't tell you what time the murder happened. Now, there's a term for that in law enforcement when something like that happens. It's called a clue. And then they interview Eddie. And Eddie's in a separate room, and he says, I want to let you know, between the hours of 12 and 2, I was at this place and this place, and I talked to my friend Jim, and Jim will tell you I was there the whole time. And again, they're thinking, we never told you what time the murder happened. It happens once, it's a clue. It happens twice, it's a clue. Now the crosshairs are clearly on Sandy and Eddie that there's something going on. Then a phone call happens just about the next day. And it comes from Lieutenant Nip. If you remember, that's Doug Nip, the quarterback of the Bisbee High School that played quarterback to Jesse's halfback when he was in high school. He's now a lieutenant for Cochise County. And he calls up the Scottsdale police and he wants to tell them of a strange incident. The incident's kind of convoluted, so I'm going to explain it to you by using some little PowerPoint graphics. And first off, I will explain that is Sandy on the left, but on the right is not her friend. I searched for 1976 female, and it came up a picture of Peggy Lipton. So I used it. Okay, so here's what happened. On May 6th, Sandy is talking to her friend on the phone. They're having this long conversation, and it's talking for quite a while. And remember, this is Bisbee 1976, so that would be like Scottsdale 1950s, because operators had to patch through calls manually. You know, almost reminds me of Lily Tomlin going one ringy-dingy, two ringy-dingies on the operator. That's what they had to do. So Eddie needs to talk to her. So he's trying to break in. And he can't. She won't get off the phone. So he contacts the operator. He says essentially, break in the phone. I need to speak to her. It's an emergency. So the operator breaks into the call, and the friend gets off the phone, and now it's Sandy's on the phone with Eddie. Now the Bisbee operator thinks, well, he said it was an emergency. That could mean he needs the police, could mean he needs fire, could mean he needs ambulance. I'll stay on the phone and listen, and that way I'll know if they need to have emergency services and I'll pass them through. So she listens as Eddie says, okay, Sandy, I've got it all set up. Got a guy who's going to come down and kill your husband. But I need 3 things. I need the exact address he's going to be at, the phone number of where he's going to be at, and a picture of him so we make sure the murderer kills the right guy. We want to make sure that he doesn't kill the wrong guy. But don't worry, Sandy, after this weekend, you're going to be free and you and I can live the life that we want to live. Okay, so now imagine that you're the operator and you've just heard that conversation. What are you going to do? Well, in this case, this operator calls the Scottsdale Police Department. And she says, there's a guy, his name is Jesse Austin. He's going to be killed in Scottsdale. There's a murder plot. It's a place on Glen Rosa. And I think he came from the mental hospital in Phoenix. That's the information that he gives to the operator. Not to this particular operator. This is just a operator in the 70s. This is Tony Tate, not the operator that he spoke to. So the operator looks it up in the internet in 1976, which we call phone books. And she looks up and it's not listed. It's information only. So it does no good. She doesn't see where Wally Austin or anyone named Austin is living on Glen Rosa. It's just not there. And she, I guess, notes it in the log, which essentially nothing from it happens. But this is very important information for the detectives to have. It certainly makes it very clear that little goof up with what hour, they know what's going on now. So the investigation switches to Cochise County, and the detectives go down there and they start interviewing people. And one of the groups that they go over to is to Fort Huachuca. And at the fort, they say, hey, was anybody off on this Saturday? I believe it was May 8th. And they said, well, we have 8,000 soldiers. So of course, probably 1,000 people were off on a Saturday. Well, did anybody report something strange or unusual? Well, yes, they did. One of the soldiers said he was down in Nogales, Mexico, which is at the bottom of the map, and that he got into a fight in a bar or something. He got stabbed in the leg and stabbed in the hand. And then he drove to Tucson to go to the Davis Montcalm Air Force Base to get treated. And then he drove home to Fort Huachuca. Now, this didn't make a whole lot of sense because that added an hour and a half to the trip. It would have been faster just to go straight to Sierra Vista and go to the hospital there. But it would make a lot of sense if, let's say, you were in Scottsdale and traveling down, and then you stop in Tucson, use the hospital, and then you continue your trip. So they interview this soldier, and his name was Anthony Riding. And Anthony gets quickly caught up in lies. First off, he told this buddy that he needed to go visit his girlfriend, but the buddy tells him it was a prostitute, or tells the detectives it was a prostitute. So there's conflicts, and the stories don't match up, and he's lying, and it gets worse and worse for him. Just through good old interrogation, he's essentially been caught up in so many lies. They know that he has played some role in this murder. So he is taken into custody. And I did want to show you this. Imagine for a second if you put on the helmet or the hat that a phone repairman wears onto this guy, it would look like this. Pretty similar, don't you think? So they tell him that he's under arrest and they're going to be taking him to Scottsdale. And now I wanted to find a picture of a police car from the inside from 1976. I couldn't, and I wanted to show how this sort of happened. So I took some liberties, so my apologies, Dennis. Dennis has seen this before. So here they are driving back in a car to Scottsdale. And Brick Goodman, who's the detective that's in the passenger seat, remembers that they were talking about baseball. It was May, the season was pretty new, and they were talking about their favorite baseball team. And all of a sudden, Anthony interrupts them and says, I guess you want me to tell you how the whole murder happened, huh? And the detectives say, yeah, we'd like to know that. Why don't you tell us? So he starts telling them the story, and essentially, at one point, Anthony Ridings was under investigation for stealing something at the base, and it was about to be federal theft charges, and Eddie Dwyer came to his defense and said, no, he couldn't have done it because he was with me, or something to that effect, that cleared Anthony of this theft charge. And based on that, he felt he owed Eddie something. So later, Eddie said, I need you to do a favor for me. I've got this guy I need you to kill in Scottsdale. And he agrees to do it for $1,500, $750 in advance, and $750 on completion of the murder. And he tells the whole story to the detectives in the car driving back from Bisbee. When they get back to Scottsdale, they say, would you mind telling that story again on camera? And Anthony Ryan says, yeah, I'll tell you the story on camera. And they go into a room and record the whole thing, the whole story of Anthony telling how this whole murder happened. Well, they then arrest the two suspects. Now you see how I got the picture of Sandy. I just cropped off her booking photo information. And that's Eddie without the toupee. And on September 21st, Eddie is walked into court. And if you see the gentleman right behind him, who is right there, that's Detective Borkenhagen behind Eddie as he's going into court. And this was on the front page of the Scottsdale Progress. So they go to the trial, and the judge finds Anthony Ridings. What do you guys think? Yeah. He's found guilty. The judge finds Edward Dwyer and Sandra Austin not guilty. The detectives and the county attorney cannot believe this. They appeal it. And in the appeals court says, not guilty. Now, what's the part that I haven't told you about? The judge said there is a legal term called the fruit of the poisonous tree. Here's a sort of graphic representation of it. The idea is that any evidence that's found from an illegal search is not admissible in court. So if you find something that leads to another thing, then leads to another thing, if the original arrest or the original search was illegal, everything you find is not valid. And they judge this as the fruit of the poisonous tree. This was originally coined by U.S. Supreme Court Judge Felix Frankfurter in 1939. One of the appeals judges was so upset about this because this had nothing to do with the police department. The police were completely exonerated. There was nothing, this was not an illegal search by the police. This was considered an illegal search by the phone company, by the operator who stayed on the line and listened to the call of the two of them planning the murder. They considered that an illegal wiretap. And that was fruit of the poisonous tree. So that the fact that that information was relayed to the police officers doing the investigation, anything that they got from that is fruit of the poisonous tree. One of the appeals judges said, the privacy of the phone has been infringed by an uninvited ear, and the suspected murderer goes free, all without the slightest hint of any police misconduct. The exclusion required by this invidious statute offends every fiber of my being, and I therefore join in the opinion simply because I have no other course. Never have I felt more strongly the need to right a wrong, or more strongly the lack of tools to do it. So Jesse was murdered. Sandy and Eddie went free. Sandy about a month later, Eddie about a year later. So when I first told this story, it was about 2019. And people kept asking me questions. There were children. What happened to the children? Did Eddie and Sandy live happily ever after? And from that, I decided to put in a section that I eventually started calling, Where Are They Now? This was the one that really got the Where Are They Now started. So there's so much to this. I tried to explain this to some of my work colleagues to see if they would understand it, and they were looking like, it's too much, Bruce. You got to figure a way to synthesize it. So here's what I came up with. Up at the top, we have a timeline of 1978 through 2020. We have all the people involved. We have Sandra, Sandy, and Jesse, the husband and wife, their two children, Jesse Jr. and Shirley. This is Jesse's mother, Mildred. She plays a little part in this. And Jesse's brother, Wally, who we've already met. Now for Sandy, she's got Eddie Dwyer, and Eddie hired Anthony Ridings. Now let's move through time and explain what happened with all of these people. So Jesse is killed, murdered, and he's cremated. That'll actually play later into one of the stories about the cremation. The result of that, Anthony is found guilty for murder, and he's sentenced to 20 years in prison. And he serves 20 years in prison. Sandy and Eddie are arrested, and Sandy serves 1 month in prison, and Jesse serves 1 year in prison, but they get out on appeal, fruit of the poisonous tree.
Eddie.
What did I say? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Eddie serves 1 year. Sandy gets out of prison after the month, and she ends up marrying a soldier from Fort Huachuca very quickly, and he gets reassigned to Italy. So she's out of prison, and off they go with the kids to Italy. And interestingly, I found this out from the family, she never explained her role in the murder to her children. That doesn't come out till years later. Eddie gets freed about 10 months later in 1979, and off he goes to New Jersey. And he ends up getting hired in a federal capacity, and they did a background check on him, and at that time, Sergeant Borkenhagen got a phone call from a federal investigator asking him, doing a background check to see if he'd be a good person to hire. Detective Borkenhagen let him know what had happened. But he's freed. He's working in some federal capacity on the East Coast, believing in New Jersey. 1980, and Wally Austin is approached by an attorney who's a friend of one of his work colleagues, and the attorney says, you have a potential lawsuit suing the Scottsdale Police Department for not protecting your brother's life after they were warned. So they file a $1 million lawsuit against the city of Scottsdale. And they don't name Wally as the victim. They name the mom, Mildred, and the 2 children. But Wally has no idea the children are in Italy and they're not available to be deposed. So later on in the course of the negotiations, the children are removed, and it's Mildred who is the person making the lawsuit. About 8 years later, they settle out of court. It was not $1 million settlement. Wally asked me not to disclose the amount. It was enough that his mother was able to live comfortably for the last part of her life. She didn't live extravagantly. She lived in a mobile home in Scottsdale. Okay? 1989, approximately, it's just a rough guesstimate. After being stationed in Italy and then Germany, Sandy and the 2 kids return. And finally, the kids hear for the first time that their mother had a role in the death of their father. And things don't go too well. But already, Jesse Jr. is having problems, because if you look at the picture of him, let me expand that photo for a second. That's a picture of Jesse Sr. with his son. You see that his son looks very much like Jesse. And I guess this did not, every time he looked at his mother was not happy. And she kind of took it out on him. So he's going to have some problems in just a little bit. But let's talk about Shirley. Shirley is at one point asked to clean out the garage. And while she cleans out the garage one day, she finds that there's a box of motor oil. And next to that, there's a box, and she opens it up, and she finds the urn of her father. It's been left in the garage. So she's not happy about that. So she gives it to her grandmother, Mildred, who takes it to Indiana to the family plot, and Jesse is buried properly. So we're now approximately 1989-ish. Let's move forward to 1992. Eddie dies of colon cancer at the age of 71. Fast forward a little bit more, 1995. Jesse Jr. when he finds out all this that his mom played this part in the murder of his father, the way he's treated, he starts getting heavily involved in drugs and alcohol, and he starts destructive behaviors that results in his death at the age of 30. 1996, it's now 20 years, and Anthony Ridings is released from prison, and off he goes to Missouri, where he's from. And I could find nothing about him in Missouri, except that he's in Missouri. But that's it. He's about 70 years old today. Now we fast forward to 2010. Mildred is now 88, I believe, and she dies. And she is buried in the family plot in Indiana. So there's now 3 people remaining of this whole story. Let's talk about them. The first one is Shirley Austin. She was married 2 times, had 4 children, got divorced the second time, found her true love the 3rd time, and she's still married today. She lives in a small town in Cochise County, but no longer in Bisbee or Sierra Vista. And according to the family, she has nothing to do with her mother. Wally Austin was really shaken up by the death of his brother. Wally blamed himself. He felt that had he been there, if he not taken and he not gone to work, if he stayed home, the murder could never have happened. There would have been 2 of them, and they would have been able to overpower the murderer. That's what he feels or felt. So he blames himself for the murder happening. He worked at Camelback Inn for a total of 13 years. Then he left there and went to work for the Sunburst. He worked there for more than 10 years, and then he ended up at the Radisson, where he stayed for the last 10 years of his career. Towards 2009, 2010-ish, he retired and looked after his mom until she died, and then he bought a home, and he's in retirement somewhere in the valley. And the most interesting person of all, Sandra Lynn Garcia Austin, Roberts now, is 77 years old. She's married. She lives in Sierra Vista, and she never had any sort of relationship with Eddie Dwyer after this. She was gone before he got out of prison, and she was exonerated of the murder charge, and she has no contact with her daughter or her grandchildren. Let's talk about the police officers involved. Ron Dean, badge number 126, was involved in several high-profile homicides, and he retired as a lieutenant, and he was a town marshal in Fountain Hills, and he died in 2011 at the age of 69. Dennis Borkenhagen was involved in several high-profile homicides, including the Bob Crane homicide. Now, before you think, wait a minute, don't they always say that Scottsdale police botched the Bob Crane? He was the guy brought in to fix the problems of the Bob Crane case. Okay? So Dennis continued his career. He was promoted, became a sergeant, and he retired and is now sitting in the audience with us today. Here's a picture of what he looks like. Brick Goodman, badge number 144, had a very successful career. He retired as a lieutenant from the Scottsdale Police Department. And that's what he looks like. And you remember Officer Don Reardon in front of the Bricklin SV1 from the very beginning of the presentation. He was a very successful career. He was an officer. He was a detective. He retired. His son became a police officer in Scottsdale, and he became a sergeant. And he is since retired now, and that is Don today, or at least a couple years ago. And Don is a woodworker, so I got to tell you this. After the first presentation, he hands me this thing. It's a Post-it note pad made of wood with my name etched in it. It's the coolest thing. So Don Reardon, woodworker, is in our room today. He also made the challenge coin holder that's in my office, if you guys have ever seen my office. And all these pictures, of course, came because the 3 came to a presentation when I first presented this. And it was actually a great thing that they did because there were several questions from the audience that I didn't know the answer to, and they were there and they answered the questions for me. So the audience there got firsthand knowledge of this whole case. But the biggest surprise, the one that always catches everyone off guard, what about that judge who ruled fruit of the poisonous tree? It must have been some sort of crazy, wacky judge who got recalled. There's got to be a story behind that, right? You'd think, wouldn't you? That judge, Sandra Day O'Connor. This was about 4 years before she was named the first Supreme Court female justice, first female Supreme Court justice of the United States, appointed by Ronald Reagan. Now, what did she know that we don't know, or that I didn't tell you the whole story of? Had the operator, and this is my interpretation, had the operator listened for a minute and hung up, that would have probably been the end of the thing. But the operator sat on the phone and listened for 15 minutes to the whole story. And that was considered an illegal wiretap and fruit of the poisonous tree. And that's how they got away with murder. I'd like to thank all the people who helped me with this presentation from my office, from the Scottsdale Public Library, from the Copper Queen Library in Bisbee who helped me, all the officers and civilians from the Scottsdale Police Department who helped. These are some of the sources that I used, from the Secretary of State's office to the history of Bisbee, Marshall Trimble's story about Lieutenant Rucker from True West magazine, also the Scottsdale Historical Society, and Wally Austin for his time sharing his family story with me. Are there any questions? Yes?
What is B1541 before your name?
The question is, what does the B1451 after my name? That is my civilian number for the Scottsdale Police Department. I was a police aide, so where they have badge numbers, I never had a badge, so I had a Bravo number, is what it's called. So I was Bravo 1451.
A what number?
Bravo. Police, you have to say Alpha, Bravo, Adam, Bravo, Charlie. I went military for a second. Yeah.
What happened to the operator? Yes.
What happened to the operator is the question. To my knowledge, nothing happened to the operator. Dennis, do you know?
I don't know. I think Lieutenant Nip was married to the operator, one of the operators.
Okay, so what Dennis just told us was that Lieutenant Nip was married to one of the operators who had overheard the conversation. And so it sounds like nothing happened to the operator.
I don't think it would have happened anywhere. I mean, civilians don't get charged with eavesdropping or whatever.
Dennis pointed out that civilians wouldn't get charged with eavesdropping, so there would have been no charge against them. And you can talk in front of the microphone, so.
I'll go back to the beginning.
Please.
Lieutenant Dean and Rick Goodman and myself went down to Bisbee and obtained a warrant, a wiretap warrant, and we wiretapped the phones of Eddie and Sandy. And we were down there for a week, and we operated out of the basement of the substation of Cochise County Sheriff's Department. And one of the phone calls, Eddie called Sandy, and he said, "I've got Jesse's ashes. What do you want me to do with them?" And she said, "Flush them down the toilet." Good move.
Yeah. Thank you, Dennis, for sharing that. I hadn't heard that one. Wow. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Does Rick Goodman still work at the courthouse?
He did before the pandemic.
Yeah.
The question was, does Rick Goodman still work at the courthouse? He was court security before the pandemic. Do you know if he's still there? He's still there? Yeah.
I just want to say thank you to both the officers for their service. I'm sure everybody here does. And you're so interesting, but it added to it with having these two gentlemen here.
Absolutely. So the comment was to thank the officers who are here for their service, and also that while she enjoyed me telling the story, it was so much more that Dennis and Don were here. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here again. And think about this, they've heard this before. They lived it. Imagine having to hear me tell the story of their life. For more classes about Scottsdale history, we're going to have more in the fall, talking about bringing back the class Scottsdale Behind the Photos, so you'll learn about the Bricklin car if you haven't seen that one. And I'm also researching a brand new class for the spring. Hopefully it'll be ready to go. And if there are no more questions, thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate you coming out virtually and in person. Have a great day.